Greetings and hello to everyone. This is the Business of Betting podcast, and I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today is part 1 of episode 7, and we have Josh Lloyd joining the podcast. Josh is a lead fantasy basketball analyst at Basketball Monster, the man behind the mic on the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast, and founder of Red Rock Fantasy Basketball. In this 2-part episode, Josh talks about all things NBA, DFS, and how the daily fantasy industry is evolving. As always, you can find us at businessofbetting.com or at bettingpod on Twitter. Please fire in any questions or feedback and potential guests you would like to hear from. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy my chat with Josh Lloyd. Today, I'm joined by Josh Lloyd. Josh, thank you very much for coming on.
No problem, Jake. Good to speak to you.
So, Josh, for those who don't know about you and what you're up to, do you want to give us some background?
Okay, so what I am the lead fantasy analyst over at basketballmonster.com, which is a site that we specialize in doing NBA basketball predictions and projections, which can be used for season-long fantasy leagues and, of course, daily fantasy NBA, where we tweak that stuff on a daily basis to give you ways to hopefully make money with DFS stuff and player projections and all that sort of stuff. So I do that, and of course I host a daily podcast on the NBA on season-long fantasy and daily fantasy called the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast.
So how long have you been doing that for? Because I know the DFS industry hasn't been around forever, and obviously the season-long and that type of rotisserie leagues back in the day has been around for a while. But have you been doing that, recently, last few years, or a bit longer?
I've been playing it playing season-long fantasy for almost 10 years. But in terms of me working in the industry, I started writing about season-long fantasy back in start of the 2013 season. Started the podcast about halfway through that year, so it started 2014. So we just ticked over 900 episodes of the podcast last week. So I've been doing that for the podcast for just a bit over 3 years now, and I've been working full-time at Basketball Monster doing the projections for the last 12 months.
Wow, congrats, 900. This is in the first 10 here, so I got a long way to go to catch up to your 900 podcast, so good stuff on getting to that stage. Do you want to tell us about how you got involved in the beginning? Were you just a mad sports fan, or were you sort of a math guy, or what led you to get into it?
I guess it's both, really. Like, through high school and stuff, maths always came fairly easily to me, and was something that I could grasp pretty easily, but never really had any thought process of taking that any further. Always was a big sports fan, the Australian sports, American sports as well. Followed the AFL here, NBA, NFL, all that sort of stuff, and then really started to get pretty heavily invested into fantasy NBA in the mid 2000s, I guess, and was successful at it. And then I was just looking for something to do as a hobby, and said, you know what, I'm pretty successful here in just me playing in these a couple of leagues a year. And there seems to be a lack of coverage around for fantasy basketball in comparison to, say, fantasy football, which is obviously a saturation of that sort of stuff. So I thought, you know what, I reckon I can put some stuff out, commit to it, and put out some quality stuff. And maybe that leads to something in the future. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just an outlet for me to get my thoughts out there. Where I disagree with what I see, I can actually have an avenue to do that. It grew. Some people started to take notice, and it went from there.
So was it tough transitioning from a full-time, as we say, real job, real life, to doing something like fantasy and projections and predictions and the write-ups and delivering all that content? Or was it sort of it was a difficult sort of few months, and then it sort of became easier and easier because you just loved doing it?
Well, the first, say, couple of years were tough because I was working two jobs pretty much. I had my full-time job. I was a pharmacist, so worked that 40, 45 hours a week, and then would come home from that and work on NBA stuff and write a daily article, check out stuff, do a podcast, which started as about a 20-minute podcast and has now evolved into about an hour and a half every day, and then heading into the 2015-16 season is when I started off with Basketball Monster. I wasn't doing it full time, but I was pretty much doing it full time. I was doing it about 30 hours a week there anyway, setting all the projections, setting stuff up for the day in advance, all the season long projections, writing a 2,000 word article every day, doing the hour and a half podcast every day. So that was tough. That was starting work in the real job at 8 in the morning or 7:30 in the morning, and finishing up your second job at 10 at night every night for 6 months was hard. But then making that transition to doing fantasy full time felt easy. Not easy, but it felt like a relief to just actually concentrate on something and have that extra time back to put more into something that you've shown you can be decently successful at over a period of a couple of years beforehand.
It's a pretty awesome story, because I'm sure a lot of people out there would like to sort of switch and do something like that, but just haven't had the longevity of doing it to get to that point, because as you said, it's not probably an easy transition. So kudos for you to sticking at it and getting to what you're doing full time now. Do you play DFS every day, as the name suggests, or are you a bit selective about it?
I play it every day at times, if that makes sense. Normally, say on the weekends here, I'm not as plugged into it, because I'm not sitting down and watching every game, because I've got to go take my son to go play tennis, or he goes and plays soccer. So in the morning here, which is when the games are on, I'm not sitting in front waiting for tip-off to change my lineups. But Monday through Friday here, during the week, during the season, I play pretty much every day until we head into March, and then all the shutdowns start happening, the weird lineups, the players with inconsistencies, and the coaches, shutting guys down. Eric Bledsoe, Timofey Mozgov, Luol Deng for the Lakers, players in and out of lineups at random times, the unknown stuff that happened with the Kings. And at that point I said, you know what, I have no confidence. I can still win at it, but I'm not playing DFS just to play it. I'm playing it because I know I can win. And when it gets to that stage and I'm less certain of winning, I just said, I'm out. Start of March, I'm out. You can have the last 6 weeks of the season. So I still covered it. I still do all that stuff, but I said I'm not putting my money out there, and really recommend it to people to really watch what sort of outlay you're putting at those types of less predictable parts of the season.
Okay, so what is your advantage with DFS? You mentioned earlier the projections and predictions type stuff. Are you individually going through each player and knowing their strengths and weaknesses and how that fits in with their team, and therefore you can find those matchup differences, or those different teams on the road at certain times that are good or bad, and those types of things? I mean, what is without going too deep into any proprietary information or what makes you have that edge, what is your advantage with the DFS?
Yeah, look, I think that's it. Like, being immersed in it pretty much 24/7, reading stuff all of the time, and having an understanding of every single player in the NBA, what their role is on a day-to-day basis, how they may match up against a certain team. Hey, you've got this guy coming in, it's Hassan Whiteside, for example, from Miami, and he's going against a team that over the last 2 weeks has allowed just a stack of rebounds. He's going to come in and got a potential to have a 20-point, 20 rebound game. So that makes him a good value. And he might have had a couple of quiet ones in the one before, and because he played against teams that don't allow as many rebounds, and that suppresses his price. So it's all about finding where that value comes in. Does he have a good opportunity? Has his price come down? And how do those two things mesh together, and finding the value in those certain spots, as well as things like the way we do our projections and how that all sits based on recent form, usage rates based on who's in, who's out, all that sort of thing.
So there's no doubt then you're treating this as an investment rather than any other type of casual sports game.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, obviously it's my job, so me providing the information to people is part of it, and being accurate with that. You have to be accurate and have I guess common sense approach to it. Otherwise, people stop listening and won't enjoy what you do. So there's that, and then there's also the fact that I'm playing to win. I'm not playing to just I'm not throwing money into DFS lineups because it increases my interest in watching the games, because I'm watching the games anyway. Like, that's doing my job. I'm putting the money in to win, and that's as simple as that.
Yeah, okay, because there's certainly a perception that there's a lot of very, very smart people playing, such as yourself, who are, I guess, the sharks, and then you've got that pool of money that's in there, which is not from the sharks. Is that how it is in reality? Is it a casual versus professional environment in DFS?
It's hard to judge just from over here. Obviously, I'm not allowed to play on the sites in the US, like FanDuel, DraftKings. I'm not able to play on those sites, and from what I understand, it's obviously a little bit of a different situation over there with that sharks versus fish sort of comparison, because the players have got the higher contest size, higher prize pools, as well as players with higher bankrolls entering. Over here, it's not so much the case because our prize pools and contests are so much smaller. So I don't see it on that necessarily level that it is in the States. But it is something that I know that the sites have been trying to reduce or combat, because that is, even if it's not 100% true, that perception is out there, and that does have an impact as well.
So what are your alternatives if you can't get access to those US-style games with the DraftKings, FanDuel? Is there a vibrant market outside of the US for DFS?
There's two major sites here in Australia. One's called DraftStars and one's called Moneyball. They're obviously quite small. Like, you can talk about the contests that run over there on FanDuel, where you've got $1 million prizes or $50,000 and multiple ones each day. And here, the biggest prize pool you can win on a day is $1,500. So we're talking a really, really small contest. So over there, you might have 70 different double-up tournaments a day. Here you have one on each site. So it just, the volume of it is so much lower. So in terms of me being able to play on this, and I couldn't make it a living just on playing DFS because the volume is too small, but you can still go in there and make really tidy return on investment numbers.
What percentage of your money that you can get down would it be if you were in another jurisdiction where you had that volume? Are you only able to get down a 10, 15, 20% of what you would like, given where you are?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably, probably accurate. Maybe 30% of what I'd like to do. And the way that I always approach playing DFS is having a really smart and stable bankroll management strategy. So depending on what you put in or what you've got in your balance, you use a sort of a set percentage of that, or a set percentage range of that money each day you play. And I've gotten to the stage now with the money, and I didn't put in much money over on these Australian sites, but the money that I've won back now is that the percentage that I would like to use each day, or my bankroll management was set up to, I can't actually spend that amount of money because there just aren't enough contests to make that worthwhile. So yeah, I'm probably wish there was. I obviously wish there was bigger numbers, and then you hope for an exponential growth in your balance after that.
So what type of monitoring are you doing on the DraftKings and FanDuels of the world, even though you can't play on there? Are you keeping an eye on what's happening there, using that market information to be better at what you're doing in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we obviously we have over on Basketball Monster, we import all that data from those sites, prices, price changes, trends. You can see all that stuff. You have contests. You can see how all this thing is going, your ownership percentages. I see all that stuff, and that the majority of my audience, whether it is over at Basketball Monster or on the podcast, is American anyway. So all the stuff that I do is catered towards that anyway. Just that when I use my own information, I play on the Australian side. So unlike lots of DFS content or podcasts or providers or anything out like that, the information I'm getting out there, a lot of people will throw that accusation out there. You're throwing out misinformation so that you can win the money yourself. And obviously, I don't have that problem because I'm not competing in the bigger pools.
Yeah, okay. Have you ever thought about moving to the US or getting involved with some type of syndicate situation there, or is it purely a Australian mode at this stage?
No, I haven't really considered moving over there just for that sort of a purpose. Obviously, I'm sure there are ways that I could work out to enter it, but you get into all sorts of legal things of like geolocation blocks. So I have to set up VPNs to try and access it. Agreements with people to put lineups in. It just becomes a bit of a messy situation. Withdrawals because you got to have US social security numbers and just a whole messy thing. So I just said, you know what? I do what I do, and my major focus is providing the information and the insight to people rather than playing and winning the money myself.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, you've got to go down the proxy path and a few other things you mentioned, so I'm sure it's a difficult situation when you really get stuck into the nitty gritty of doing it. Have you? I mean, I know in sports betting, certainly the current environment is people are getting banned or reduced bet sizes, things like that. Is there anything in the DFS world of a similar vein? Do they? Obviously, they probably won't ban you because it's more of a peer-to-peer situation rather than you versus the DFS company. But are they tending to limit the sizes that you can get down in Australia?
No. Look, they have limits. Like each contest has a limit. Like there might be, for example, a 600 entry contest, and you can put 15 entries in. So it's limited that way. There's no limit as to what you can put down in total over here. Like you can throw it out in multitude of head-to-heads. You can enter every single tournament or double up contest across any sport. There's none of that limit. There's just entry limits across contests, which are relatively restricted.
This might be a dumb question, but is there season-long fantasy games that you can play on a sort of a certain websites where you can put in a lot of volume over a season-long period, or is that just return on investment and time value of money getting stuck there for a whole season doesn't make it a lucrative option?
You can do it, definitely, and I really only started to dip my toe into doing that this season. I entered two of those leagues this year. I won one of them and came like fifth in the other, so I ended up with a significant return on investment. But as you say, it's a return on investment that comes over a 6-month period. So you got to have confidence that you're going to win them, and you can't win 5 out of 7 days and have a profitable week. It's over the course of the season. So in terms of investment portion of that, it's not an ideal thing unless you're putting in big volumes, and then it gets harder to manage that over a season just because you've got so many teams to try and get your head around at all times.
So that must be a bankroll issue as well, because you've got 150 to 200 days of your money tied up. Are you trying to, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but are you trying to get 150x down on season-long games, or are you, I mean, it doesn't sound like a very reasonable option because of the possibility of that return, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there are some that have fairly decent entry sizes. Majority are sitting at like $100, $50, that sort of stuff for the season, and you can pull in 1,000, 1,200 as a winning prize and those sort of things, which is not bad. But you're talking about you got a 1 in 12 chance of getting that, so you got to have confidence in what you're doing. But it's not something where I'd go in there and go, okay, let's set up 30 teams at $100 each at the start of the season and hope it all pays out, because it is, then it becomes a bankroll issue that you've got that money sitting there and your investment doesn't come for 6 months, if it even comes at all.
Yeah, okay. So on a day-to-day basis then, you've obviously got lots and lots of entries, I would imagine. What type of staggering do you have to do to maximize your return? Are you trying to cover, I guess, lots of different players that you like in many different teams, and are you doing that manually, or is there some way to automate that a little bit and get hundreds and hundreds of entries in without too much effort?
There are ways to do that, to do the automation stuff. I don't do it personally. The contest sizes over here don't require it, and basically what I do is as I come in and I play the majority of my contests, like 80% of what I put down is in the double up. So I'm looking for my most optimal lineup. So when I'm talking about DFS contests to people on the podcast, I'll say if you're putting the majority of your money into the double ups, it's not as flashy as saying I won $50,000 today. But if you're going to do it as a long-term thing, you can just double your money every day of what you're doing, and there's more consistency with that. It's about finding the consistent floor rather than the crazy upside ceiling that you need to win those large tournaments, which comes down more to luck and broadness of entry. So when I'm doing it, I'll put in one lineup and I'll really concentrate on those 50-50s. And I'm sure people listening to this podcast would know what I'm talking about with 50-50s and double ups. It's basically the same return for everybody who finishes in the top half of the field. You put in $10, you get $20 back. If you finish between 1 and 50, if you finish between 51 and 100, you win nothing. Whereas the tournaments are staggered, where if the top 17 to 18% of the field wins, and it's like 10,000 to first, 2,000 to second, $300 to third, and then it just whittles right down. So you need to be right at that pointy end. So you're needing that high upside. But in terms of a cash management bankroll thing, putting the majority of your money into the double ups is a better way to build that bankroll and have a consistent income or consistent winning strategy, I guess, doing that rather than just always shooting for the stars. So what I do is I put that lineup in that consistent, hopefully one where I feel confident with the floor of it, put that into those double up lineups, and then I throw it into one of those tournaments. And if it comes good and it gives me a return of, I win it, or it comes second and I get my $1,200 or $1,500, which is the prize pool here, so be it. If it doesn't, no big deal. But if you're looking to win those big ones, you do have to have a core group of players that you're looking at, and then diversify it and try and find the players who will be owned in fewer lineups or be rostered in fewer lineups, so that you can separate yourself from the big group of people who are going to have similar lineups.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a deep dive into the strategy behind things. Do you ever think about betting full time, or even is there a part of your operation that is a betting? Under overs, head to head, those type of things, because I would imagine there's certain circumstances certainly where your edge in the DFS would translate, or is that not the case?
Yeah, look, it's something that I need to research more. I started doing a little bit of it last season, but that was mainly season-long total over-unders, over 50 wins, under 50 wins, that sort of stuff, and waiting on a few of those results to come in, like MVP, Rookie of the Year, season-long prop stuff, and probably won 70% of my season-long over-under totals. In terms of the day-to-day over-unders, spreads, that sort of stuff, I think with what we can do with our projections and our formulas and stuff that we run over at Basketball Monster, that we could be profitable with that. I haven't looked into it enough because obviously I'm trying to work out the individual player projection stuff more. But that can easily tie into the team-based stuff. But if I can run, I probably will look at doing this over the off-season, run studies on it and see how you can beat that edge there. And I think there might be something to work into it, but I haven't really started to look into it that much. Okay,
makes sense. So the DFS stuff, is it a completely different skill, do you think, to sports betting? I know there's obviously the salary cap aspect, and I don't know how difficult that is to get a handle on it, given I don't play sort of DFS on the NBA side, but is it a completely different skill, do you think?
Yes and no. I think your base knowledge of it is similar. Having an understanding of the game and what's happening on a micro level as well, who's in, who's out, players, teams, back-to-backs, road. Have they played 3 games in 4 nights? Is this player slumping because of X? Did he just have a kid and he's tired? Is he coming off an injury? All that sort of stuff where you add those factors in, but then it diverges with that salary cap differentiation part of it and trying to fit players in where they become extra important, whereas in a sports betting sort of situation, someone who might come in at 20 minutes a game is not going to have a massive impact on the overall result, but it can really sway things in DFS if they're priced at the right amount. But your overall knowledge base and looking at how the game is going to play out, I think there's a fair degree of similarity there.
So what about the certain sports books that offer fantasy-related bets? Have you ever delved into that at all?
No, I haven't. So how do you mean? Give me an example of what you mean, the sports books offering that.
So I know certain sports books around the world will have literally under-over fantasy points in a game. So, for example, Australian football, there might be, Gary Ablett Jr. will have under-over 111 Supercoach points, or 111.5, sorry. And
okay.
You can literally bet on that. Obviously, the volume that you might be able to get down on that sort of stuff is going to be very tough and very difficult given the sports betting environment, but it seems to be popping up a lot more with a lot more information out there and a lot more fantasy players who might be wanting to not necessarily spend 45 minutes going through their DFS roster and trying to pick and fit in 5 or 6 guys into their lineup. They might just want to go, you know what, I got a little bit of an edge here. I might just try and go to the bookmaker and place a bet. Is that even a possibility in the future, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is. Like I personally haven't seen that myself, but it makes complete sense of being able to do that. Obviously when you're creating a lineup, you're pretty much trying to get an idea of where that guy's points are, but on a 9-man or 8-man basis, what do I think this guy's going to get? What do I think this guy's going to get? Where's his upside? Where's his ceiling in terms of those total points? And you can break it down to a single player thing. I think there's definite potential in being able to do that and get an edge in it.
Yeah, it's probably even implied in the salary cap value on some of those big sites. And then if you think, you probably have an edge with one of those players, and you can't, I guess, match it up with, I might even ask you, if you want to match it up with other players to get a roster that fits in. So, for example, if Chris Paul is, for some reason tonight, going to be your biggest play, and you're trying to find different scenarios, how would you go about doing that? Would you pick players that are most highly picked and just match him up with those players so that you're maybe 1 point of difference? Everyone's going Westbrook or everyone's going Harden, but you know Chris Paul's a better option. Would you match him up with players that are highly picked or underpicked?
It depends on what sort of tournament you're looking at, what sort of contest. If you're looking in those GPP, large player pool, large prize pool contests, you want to go with the lower owned thing, the lower owned player. So someone who has 2%, 3% ownership rather than 30 or 40, or sometimes, especially when we're in the playoffs, you're having some players sitting at 85% ownership, and they're the guys in those sort of tournaments you want to steer clear of. But in general, when you're looking at the double ups, 50-50s, you're taking these guys who have high ownership. You want that, and with just a couple of points of differentiation, so that even if, say, one of those high differentiation guys fails, you're going to put yourself still in that zone of being able to return your money as well. So you're getting those players, and the reason they're generally highly owned is because they've got a higher level of consistency that they're going to bring those numbers back. But otherwise, if you think that everyone's going with Westbrook, switching it over to Paul and going with some other low-owned players and with maybe 2 or 3 core guys that might be owned in majority of lineups is I think the way to go.
So what about hedging? Obviously in sports betting and trading and investing you can hedge. It doesn't sound like you can hedge with regards to DFS. Is there any way you can hedge other than putting in different lineups?
Yeah, that's really the only way that I can see doing it is being able to put those secondary or tertiary lineups in, or 100 different lineups, whatever you're doing. But there also comes a point where if you do that too much, you cut into any sort of profit margin you make anyway, because they're not all obviously going to be successful. So there is a real skill in being able to do it, and that's why that sort of a process is really only possible in those high prize or high payout tournaments, where that if one of your 100 lineups hits, you get 50 grand. Whereas if it was a lower prize pool and you had, say, you put 10 different lineups into a double up, where all you do is double your money, then your expected value return on that is just not worth that diversity or differentiation. But in those other ones, if 1 out of 100 hits, then you've covered that by 10, 20, 30 fold.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that's why when I was mentioning the sportsbook stuff, it was interesting to me because it seems like something that would be a huge value proposition for those who are playing, who want to have, single player hedges, or just a different tool, I guess, different mechanism to have another out, essentially, when you're talking about the sports betting vernacular, when they say, you need to have different places to go. It seems like it would be an option. Do you think it's just there's too many smart or really highly talented DFS players compared to the middle tier and lower tier when it comes to sports betting? Obviously, you've got those high volume, efficient syndicates who are playing quite often, and then you've got different levels of sports bettors who are really competent, really good at what they do, whether it be 1 or 2 man shows or even just your everyday punter. When it comes to sort of DFS, it sounds like, or seems like, certainly looking from the outside, that it's a really tough industry to crack, and there's not a lot of coverage or good coverage, and it's not a lot of mainstream good coverage to get that sort of middle tier of people involved, and therefore you've really got the really smart guys playing, and then you've got a large pool of, I guess, others. Is that sort of how it is?
Yeah, it is. I think, and part of that is because it is, as you said earlier, peer-to-peer. So you can have these large syndicates in sports betting, and they can go and put whatever they want to put on, and they can win their money. But that doesn't preclude other people from winning as well. It doesn't stop. Like, just because they've gone and won big on the Patriots covering the line doesn't mean that I can't go and win big on the Patriots covering the line. But when you're talking DFS, someone has to win and someone has to lose, because you're going against each other. And when I talk about stuff on my podcast, I'm looking more at those middle tier guys, trying to find a way, not for them to come in and necessarily become professional at it or do it full time, or rake in 6 figures every year from it, but being able to do it and return a profit and a sizable profit on a consistent basis, so that they find themselves pushing from maybe that lower tier to the middle tier to the upper middle tier, without actually pushing those sharks who do it 18 hours a day, and develop proprietary software to run their lineups, to generate their lineups, to do all their projections, similar to what we're doing as well. But you had pretty decent success with people that listen to the show and use the site being able to be a positive nearly every season they play with it.
Okay, so how do you think, have you got any ideas how the DFS sort of world can grow volume? Because certainly if the industry is going to grow and get bigger and better and stronger, it's going to need that volume. And I think the industry is probably glad to have people like you out there giving great content out, essentially for free to people who want to find it, which will help grow volume overall. And that's better not only for the industry, but also for you as you want to get more money down potentially in the future. Is there anything the industry can be doing to grow that volume that you can sort of think of?
I think especially over here, it's an awareness thing as well. Like it's just the concept of fantasy sports in Australia is a real different one to what it is over in the States. So for the sites trying to grow it here, they've got work to do, because they've got to not only because in the States, fantasy is probably the biggest form of gambling, whether it's season long, whether it's March Madness pools. Over here, because our sports gambling has been legal for so long, that they've got a lot of work to get into that. But it's more about those things that are popping up, as you said, like individual player props, not necessarily fantasy stuff, but it might be first goal kicker stuff, most points in a game, and then getting people into that side of it, and then I guess leveraging off that and getting people to create those lineups. And it is growing. You see the size of contests growing here. I think Moneyball's only been around for 2 years. Draft Stars has only been around for 1 year. So they've got a bit of way to go, and advertising's just started popping up on TV over here. So they do have a bit of a way to go, but it's a big mindset change over here, because sports betting is so much more ingrained than what fantasy is, whereas in the States, fantasy has such a strong foothold for the last 20, 30 years, and it was just a way to move forward from that, rather than trying to swing, I guess, the way that people see things, which is what happens over here.
So I'm Jason Robbins, and I give you a call tomorrow and say, Josh, we're worried about legal sports betting hitting the US. You have a good sort of insight in the industry. You see what happens here with my company. What can I do to, I guess, prepare for the storm that is legal sports betting when it hits the US, given what Australia's like, and potentially your peers will be switching over to sports betting if they want to get more volume down? What would you say to Jason Robbins? Have you got any sort of, I guess, ideas, certainly for the US, where it is a mature market and they have sports like baseball, which is a statistics heavy, and it's a strong statistics and sabermetrics culture. And then obviously NBA, where you've got sort of the volume. What can they be doing in the US, I guess, from an isolated perspective where there's no sports betting now, to sort of prepare for that and try and make it a more friendly environment, given they have a big sort of monster waiting in the background to come in?
Good question. I think what will happen, and you touched on it, if and when sports betting becomes legal, is that they will suffer an initial drop of volume. But I think that people that might go and do that might find that them being able to consistently win money becomes harder in sports betting if it's not something they have been, I guess, looking at consistently for the past 15 years, 10 years, 5 years. And that initial learning curve might say, you know what, I might go back to this thing that I know and thing that I've been relatively successful at. But it's all about managing the expectations of people. And I know that these sites will go in there and they're talking about, and they do it less now, but let's go in and you can become a millionaire. And that's what disenfranchises people initially, is they come in, I didn't win $1 million in my first month. This is terrible. This is rigged. This is useless. I'm bad at it. Whereas I think maybe a different approach. And then they're starting to move to that now, more like you can play this with your mates. You play that with your friends, get some money, get bragging rights, be invested in the players rather than a total score outcome. And I think that's the way that they need to push. But there will definitely be some sort of hit when it does become legal. But I think it will bounce back. So
how has the DFS sort of culture, and I guess DFS in general, changed since it began? Because it's obviously not that old. Has there been sort of fundamental changes since the first few seasons that it's sort of existed to now?
Yeah, look, the changes are things that they do in terms of limits on contest entries, on beginner contests, just different. So you're not getting that problem of people saying, "Oh my God, I'm going up against this same person every time, and they're going to kill me." And this guy's a shark, and they're in every tournament. And being able to separate that out and improve, I guess, the retention rate that way, and the fun factor for people, because they aren't getting killed on a consistent basis. So there's been more of a change for that, more of a, I guess, transparency sort of feel to this is what we're trying to do to show you that you're not just there to get beaten. And I think a lot of that comes from people, as I touched on earlier, not investing in it in the right way, of going in there, throwing all their money into this tournament, going, oh, of course this person won the prize. Look how much money look at them. They've got all these lineups, but they don't realize that person probably lost 20K the day before by putting in 200 lineups, and that overall, look, they're not winning it every day, but it's a perception thing. So changing that perception is definitely swinging in the right direction, I think.
What type of data and information can you get, or what's available from those sites where you're playing? Can you get that sort of lineup information and, I guess, player profiles on who you're up against and what their entry sizes are and what their number of entries are and that type of stuff, or are you just finding that elsewhere?
You find most of that elsewhere. Like I can't delve into that stuff as much because I get banned from the site, so I've got to get that through third party. I get banned because of my geolocation, obviously, but you can see who players are and their names and I guess contest history as well. So, and people who are sort of even semi into the DFS scene will know who the bigger players are and know those names and know their usernames across the sites, and it's pretty straightforward to see those sort of guys out there. But in terms of when I'm looking at it, I don't really look at someone. Just from when I'm playing over here, there are players that you see their name pop up all the time and go, this guy has, I've seen this guy win a couple of times. I recognise this name, but I don't go into it and say, what's he doing with his lineup? How's he constructing his lineup? Because if you're just following someone's trends like that, you're never going to beat them. You're going to at best equal them. So what's the point of that?
Yeah, okay. So you need to differentiate yourself, otherwise you're no chance anyway.
Yeah, because if you're just going to copy someone else, then the best you can do is be the same. So how does that end up? You can look at their stuff and go, okay, I understand the theory of what they're doing, but you can find that in many different areas as well. It's about gaining an understanding of whatever game that you're playing and developing that theory from there, rather than thinking that these so-called sharks have the answer to everything, because they don't win every day. And as I said, they'll suffer big losses and big losses days and days in a row. But they have this, and people think, it's not fair. They've got this big bankroll. The reason they've got this big bankroll is because they were good and they built it up. It's not like they all came in with like, I'm starting this off with $1 million, so you guys are all screwed. Like they won their money by being good at that or playing poker or whatever they were doing. But they won the money by being good at it. And that sort of advantage does help them, but you can still win enough money to make it profitable and fun and enjoyable. So
how is the DFS community? Because certainly I'm obviously living in the US, so I see that sort of gambling Twitter in the US, and there's a lot of venom and angst, certainly in the US, with touts, and certain gambling sort of providers and communities here cop a fair bit. And obviously Australia, there's other issues, whether it's, bookmaker ads flashed everywhere and advertising, and then certain companies sort of linking up with that. What is the DFS community like?
Yeah, there's a bit of that happens with it as well. The Australian DFS community, I don't really interact with them at all. I know some of the names, but even they say the US DFS community, I know the names, but I'm not interacting. I'm not jumping on the DFS forum sites and discussing any of this stuff. I try and keep out of that as much as possible. And it's deliberate in my sense, because I don't want to get sucked into conflict of interest discussions or the notion of boys clubs and that sort of stuff. I want to go out there, put my information out that I get on an independent basis. Like I work this stuff out myself and put it out there and have people use what I say. And I deliberately don't go out there and say, this is a lineup, use it. And I have an issue with that. I have an issue with that sort of a mentality of like, subscribe to me, $20 a week, and I'll give you winning lineups every day. I'll DM them out on Twitter to you. I have a real issue with that. People ask me, "Oh, can you just sell lineups?" I just don't believe in that. I'd rather provide the information and you do with it what you want and get the skills to become someone who is better in that industry rather than just spoon feeding. Here's a lineup, go and play it. And I just don't think that's the right way to go. So there is a bit of venom towards that sort of stuff about lineup sellers and people copying other lineups, and the fact that those lineup sellers will then, you'll go and enter a tournament and you might see the same lineup in there 100 times, and that can be a problem. And I really try and steer clear of that as much as I can.
Yeah, okay. Sounds like similar issues overlap. So do any of the DFS sites help the bigger players? Because obviously there would be an incentive to create more volume. Do they offer any type of incentives for those bigger players to sort of get that volume into the markets at all?
It's a good question. I've never really looked into it because I'm not dealing with those bigger sites really. I'm sure that there is some sort of incentive, but they also want to make it that they're not providing advantage to those people that others think are, destroying everyone else on a daily basis. There's always, sign up incentives and promo codes for first deposit bonuses and stuff like that, which goes that way. But I don't see it enough because I'm not ingrained in that DFS culture or forums and dealing with those guys as much as I could be, and that's a deliberate thing.
Hi everyone, thanks for listening to part 1 with Josh. Keep an eye out next week for part 2, and we go even deeper into DFS, NBA, and some more general basketball topics. So as always, thanks a lot for listening, and be sure to see next week's episode, part 2, with Josh Lloyd.